Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to speak. I'm very happy to be taking part in this conference. Today, I want to talk about actions of big mapping class groups on modified art complexes. And everything I talk about today is going to be joint work with Nick Miller and Priyam Patel. So mapping class groups are defined based on surfaces, and big mapping class groups are defined via infinite type surfaces. A surface is infinite type if its fundamental group is infinitely generated. So here are some examples of infinite type surfaces, and you should imagine that these surfaces are going off to infinity in sort of all the indicated directions where it's blank. These aren't boundary components. So this ladder surface, for example, it goes off to infinity to the right and to the left, and you should imagine that this genus that's shown there continues in both directions, so it actually has a countable amount of genus. And the two infinite type surfaces that I'm going to be using for examples today are the ladder surface and the blooming cantor tree. So here we also have infinite genus, so we've got sort of genus running down all the different branches of this tree, this kind of thickened tree. A mapping class group is the orientation preserving homeomorphism group of a surface up to isotopy. And if the surface is infinite type, then the mapping class group is called big. And big is a really apt name for these mapping class groups. So despite the similarity in how they're defined, these groups behave very differently. So a regular mapping class group of a finite type surface is a finitely presented group, finitely generated, finitely presented. But a big mapping class group, well, first, it's a topological group, it's a Polish group, and it's not even compactly generated. So the behavior of regular mapping class groups and big mapping class groups can be quite different. However, the behavior of regular mapping class groups is often used as a sort of a jumping off point in the study of big mapping class groups. So we've used the behavior of regular mapping class groups to sort of help us understand what questions we should ask. And the jumping off point from regular mapping class groups that I'd like to use to talk about, or my research today, is the Nielsen-Thurston classification of elements. So for a regular mapping class group of a finite type surface, there is a classification of elements, a trichotomy. Every mapping class is either pseudo-Anosov, reducible, or finite order. And the question is there a similar kind of classification for big mapping class groups? So the mapping class group of a surface which is infinite type. So this is one of the major open questions for big mapping class groups right now. I'm not going to present an answer to this question, but I want to focus on one possible category in a possible classification. And that is going to be an analog of a pseudo-Anosov element, but for big mapping class groups. So let me start by telling you what a pseudo-Anosov element is for a regular mapping class group, and we're again going to use that as a jumping off point to see how we should define this for big mapping class groups. So there's several definitions I can give you. The one I'm going to choose is using the curve graph of a finite type surface. So the curve graph associated to a finite type surface is the graph whose vertices are isotopy classes of simple closed curves and whose edges correspond to disjointness. So here is a finite type surface. I've drawn 3 simple closed curves on there. Each of those curves is going to give me a vertex of my curve graph. So there's a red vertex, a green vertex, and a blue vertex. And the red and green vertices are, the red and green curves here are disjoint, so they're connected by an edge in this graph. Similarly, the blue and the green curves are disjoint, so they're connected by an edge, but the red and the blue intersect, so they're not. And I want to emphasize that this is just a small piece of the curve graph. The curve graph is going to be an infinite valent graph and quite complicated. So in '99, Mazur and Minsky showed that for almost every finite type surface, the curve graph is an infinite diameter hyperbolic graph. And moreover, an element of the mapping class group is pseudo-Anosov exactly when that element is a loxodromic isometry of the curve graph. So a loxodromic isometry of a hyperbolic space is one that acts as translation along an axis. So in particular, the orbit is unbounded and will give you a quasi-geodesic going off to infinity in 2 directions. And that's the quasi-geodesic axis. So it's this definition that I'd like to try to generalize to a class of elements for big mapping class groups. And the first thing that you want to sort of naively try is to simply do the exact same thing, but for an infinite type surface. So the curve graph of an infinite type surface, well, we can define it exactly the same way. The vertices will be isotopy classes of simple closed curves, and the edges will correspond to disjointness. So this is a perfectly valid graph. The mapping class group acts on this graph by isometries, just like it does in the finite type case, but we've got a bit of a problem. So here's a collection of finitely many simple closed curves. So if you give me any collection, finite collection of simple closed curves, I've drawn these four fairly straightforward curves, but they could be as complicated as you want. This is sitting in the ladder surface. They're going to be contained in some finite type subsurface because there's only finitely many of them. Now, here you can see this finite type subsurface. I could just cut off the ladder on these two, right on either side of this collection of curves, and I've got a finite type subsurface. If I choose any simple closed curve in the complement of that finite type subsurface, so that doesn't intersect it, it's going to be disjoint from that finite collection I started with. So that means that in the curve graph, I'm going to have these black vertices. Those are corresponding to this finite collection of curves I started with, and they're all going to be connected to this red vertex, which corresponds to the simple closed curve that is disjoint from the subsurface. So this tells us that, in fact, the curve graph, while we can define it, it's finite diameter. It's diameter 2. So there won't be any loxodromic isometries. So it's not a very helpful graph. And so the question is there an infinite diameter hyperbolic graph associated to an infinite type surface? And the answer is yes, as long as we assume that our surface has an isolated puncture. So if we have an infinite type surface with at least one isolated punctures, there could be more isolated punctures, and there could be plenty of punctures that are not isolated or not, but we just need the existence of a single isolated puncture, then we can define what's called the modified arc graph. So in the modified arc graph, the vertices are isotopy classes of simple arcs that begin and end at P. Now I wrote beginning / ending. If you could either have arcs that begin and end at P, or that begin or end at P, and in fact, you're going to get quasi-isometric graphs, so it doesn't matter. In my case, I'm going to tend to think of a single isolated puncture, and these will begin and end at this puncture. And the edges are going to correspond to disjointness, just like for the curve graph. So here's an example. So here's again the ladder surface, but now I've punctured it. So this X is supposed to be representing the single isolated puncture P. And now I've drawn 3 different arcs that start and end at P, red, green, and blue. And the red and the green and the blue and the green arcs are disjoint, so we're connecting them by an edge, but the red and the blue arcs are not disjoint, so we don't connect them by an edge. And just like for the curve graph, this is just a very small piece. These arcs could be very complicated. So it's a result of Armayona, Fossis, and Parlier from 2017 that this is, in fact, an infinite diameter hyperbolic graph. So that's good news. So here's an infinite diameter hyperbolic graph associated to an infinite type surface. Now, there's one problem, which is that the entire mapping class group doesn't act on this graph. And the reason is that the mapping class group might not fix that puncture. However, if we look at the subgroup of the mapping class group, which does fix that puncture, then that will act by isometries on this modified arc graph. And in fact, if your surface only has a single isolated puncture, then this subgroup will in fact be the entire mapping class group. And if your surface has only a finite collection of isolated punctures, then this subgroup will be finite index in your mapping class group. So from now on, I'm going to focus on this subgroup which fixes the puncture, and in many cases, we're not actually losing a lot of information by focusing on this subgroup. So the question becomes, what are the loxodromic isometries of this graph for the action of this subgroup on this graph? Well, Armayona, Fossis, and Parlier show that if you have an element of the big mapping class group, which is supported on a finite type subsurface and is pseudo-anosoph on that finite type subsurface, and the subsurface contains the puncture, then that element will be a loxodromic isometry. Moreover, just recently, Morales and Valdez showed they found some elements that are loxodromic isometries, and they constructed them as the limits of homeomorphisms that are supported on finite type subsurfaces. So these are some examples of the loxodromic isometries. But the question that Nick and Priyam and I were really interested in is, are there loxodromic isometries of this graph which are intrinsically infinite type? So by that, we mean that they can't be described using the finite type subsurfaces. So they're not supported on a finite type subsurface, and they're not the limit of things that are supported on the finite type subsurface. So what we really mean formally is that these are elements that are in the complement of the closure of the compactly supported subgroup of the mapping class group. So there is one example of this. So Bavard constructs elements of this type for the specific surface that is a sphere minus a Cantor set and also minus the North Pole. And Bavard's work is what really inspired our work. Now, the first thing you want to ask is, does our previous question actually make sense? Are there any infinite type elements of the mapping class group? And the answer is that yes, there are. They're called handle shifts, and these were first described by Patel and Vlamas. So here's an example. So this surface here is the ladder surface, but rather than thinking of the genus in the ladder surface as kind of punching through, like in the previous pictures I've shown, I'm thinking of this surface as a cylinder with discs removed and then handles glued onto the disc. So I've kind of taken the genus that punctures through and I've just pulled it out to be handles instead. So a handle shift comes with a domain. So the red lines on this graph are the domain, and the domain is everything that's between those two lines, including these handles. So 3 of these handles are inside of the domain. And what a handle shift does is it shifts its domain to the right 1 handle. And to the right is simply because this arrow here is pointing to the right, indicating that this particular handle shift moves to the right. Now there's some technicalities here, really. It shifts the domain to the right, and outside of the domain, it's the identity. And really what you do is you kind of thicken the boundary of the domain and taper it from a shift to the identity. And if you notice the puncture I've drawn on this surface, this X back here is not contained in the domain of the handle shift. So this handle shift does in fact fix the puncture. So let me give you an example, sort of describe a little more detail what this handle shift does. And I'm going to do it by showing you the image of some arcs. And I'm choosing arcs rather than simple closed curves because we're looking at actions on the arc graph. So here's an arc alpha. So it starts at the puncture and it goes and it loops around that first handle. And if I apply this handle shift H, it's now going to just loop around the second handle. And if I apply H again, it's not going to loop around the third handle, but it's going to loop around the fourth handle. And that's because the third handle isn't in the domain of the handle shift. So if I'm shifting 1 to the right within the domain, it moves over to this fourth handle. And notice that how it gets from the puncture to the fourth handle follows the boundary of the handle shift. So the handle shift domain goes underneath this arc here, underneath this handle. So that's how the arc travels as well. It travels underneath the handle, around the fourth handle, underneath the third handle, around the fourth handle, and then back. However, this is one possibility for an infinite type loxodromic isometry. Unfortunately, it's not loxodromic. And one way that you can see that is if you look at the original arc alpha here in this first picture, it's disjoint from the images I've shown. And in fact, it's going to be disjoint from H to the I alpha for all positive I, which means that in the modified arc graph, alpha is going to be connected to all of its images to the right. So this is actually an elliptic isometry. It has bounded orbits. It's not loxodromic. So the main result with Nick and Priyam is that for most infinite type surfaces, there's an infinite family of infinite type elements, Gn, which are loxodromic isometries of the modified arc graph. And again, infinite type elements here means that it's not supported on a finite type subsurface, and it's not a limit of elements of homeomorphisms that are supported on finite type subsurfaces. So I'm not going to tell you precisely what most means, but I'm going to give you an idea. I'm going to show you the construction of this and give you an idea of how we do this. And that will give you some indication of what the infinite type surfaces require. The one thing they definitely require is an isolated puncture, but we require a little bit more than that. Okay, so here's our first step. The first thing we do is we embed this particular subsurface, sigma prime, into our infinite type surface. And we need to do it in such a way that the complements of the boundary components are homeomorphic. So these S1s here are boundary components. So this is like, so far what this looks like is a cylinder, an infinite cylinder with discs removed, the interiors of discs removed, and the cylinder contains the puncture. So what you should think of doing is in your infinite type surfaces, choosing simple closed curves and just cutting along those simple closed curves. That's going to give you these boundary components. And we want to do that in such a way that the complements of the boundary components are homeomorphic. So the other thing about this sigma prime is that I don't care what the back looks like. It doesn't actually have to be a cylinder with the interiors of discs removed. The back could have all kinds of topology. There could be genus there could be punctures, ends, it doesn't matter. All I care about is on the front, I've got this countable number of boundary components whose complements are homeomorphic. So here's going to be sort of two examples in one. This is the blooming canter tree. And the boundary components of sigma prime could be the blue curves or the red curves. So let's think about the blue curves first. The blue curves, I've taken the genus that runs along one bi-infinite branch of this canter tree, and I've just pulled it out into handles, kind of like I did with the ladder surface. And then the blue curves are where those handles are attached to the tree. So that's going to give me a countable collection of simple closed curves. And so I can cut along those blue curves, and the complements here are just going to be these little handles. So they're going to be homeomorphic. And in this case, all of these other branches, all of the rest of this, I'm going to think of as being on the back of sigma prime. So the front of it is going to just look like a collection of these blue curves, and the back is going to be kind of the rest of the tree. All kinds of things are happening back there, but we don't care about it. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the simple closed curves, these boundary components, are the red curves here. And in this case, if you take a look, what the red curves cut off are these subtrees of the blooming canter tree. And those are homeomorphic. Those subtrees are all homeomorphic because of the structure of this canter tree. So now, if the red curves are boundary components on sigma prime in the front, then the back of sigma prime is just going to contain these handles. So the front will be red boundary components, and the back will be a countable collection of handles. And then the rest of the branches, all this bottom right part here, is what's cut off. So this is the requirement on our surface. We need to be able to embed sigma prime into our surface sigma. So we need to be able to find such a collection of simple closed curves so that when we cut along them, their complements are homeomorphic, and they also need to sort of go out to two distinct ends of our surface. They need to go to infinity in two different directions. Okay, so let's assume that we have a surface with an isolated puncture and we can actually embed this subsurface sigma prime. Now we're just going to focus on sigma prime. And we're going to build our homeomorphism. I'm just going to give you a description of one of them, so I'm going to drop the subscript. I'm going to build it out of 3 handle shifts, and I'm going to define those handle shifts on sigma prime rather than the entire infinite type surface. And here are the 3 handle shifts. So H1 and H3 shift to the right, and H2 shifts to the left. So what I'm drawing here are the domains of the handle shifts. So one thing I want you to notice about this choice of handle shifts, and that is that if you think about a pseudo-Nossoff in a finite type case, what makes them pseudo-Nossoffs, the reason that they act loxodromically on the curve graph, is that they really mix up the surface, right? If you look at the image of a nice, straightforward, simple closed curve on a finite type surface and you iteratively apply a pseudo-Nossoff, that curve gets very, very complicated, and eventually in its limit, it fills the surface. So we want that same kind of mixing behavior out of the homeomorphism that we construct, and in particular, because it's acting on the arc graph, and the arcs start and end at this puncture, at this X, we want to be sure that we're really mixing things up around the puncture. So if you notice, H1 and H3 shift to the right and go underneath the puncture, whereas H2 shifts to the left and goes over the puncture. So if you apply H1, then H2, then H3, what we're doing is going under the puncture to the right, over to the left, under to the right. So the composition of handle shifts is going to start swirling things around the puncture. And as you iteratively apply it, the area near the puncture is going to get more and more complicated. And then because of the way these handle shifts are defined, that complicated structure is going to kind of percolate outwards from the puncture. But that's the idea behind this choice of handle shifts. And so we claim that this homeomorphism G is in fact a loxodromic isometry of the arc graph. So to show that, we need to build a quasi-geodesic axis. So I'm going to show you what that axis looks like. So here's an arc. This is our first point on the axis, alpha naught. It's a nice straightforward arc. And if we apply our homeomorphism once, it becomes alpha 1. It looks like this. And now if we apply it again, suddenly it's gotten very complicated. This is alpha 2. And so this is actually just a train track drawing because it's complicated. So if you notice the numbers here, like this 8, that's giving you the weight. So that's the number of strands that actually follow this same pattern. So there's 8 strands going around this boundary component, there's 2 going around here. And if you look at what's happened near the puncture, we've looped the puncture, right? We've wrapped around the puncture there. And we've wrapped around it with 4 different strands. And if we continue applying G, this is what it's going to look like at the kth step. So notice that the arc is expanding outwards. It's going from -1 up to k plus 1 in the kth step. And the number of times that we wrap around the puncture is going to be roughly on the order of 2 to the k. I haven't written the weights on there. But this will be roughly on the order of 2 to the k. The number of strands wrapping around this k plus 1 boundary component way off to the right is 2. And then it kind of extrapolates in between. So we need to prove this is a quasi-geodesic axis. This proof is quite complicated, and it's inspired by Juliette Bavard's proof for the sphere minus the Cantor set. So we use her same sort of outline of a proof, but all of it is much more complicated because we're working in this more general situation. So in particular, the 2 things I want to mention are first, that her first step is to code the arcs on a sphere minus a Cantor set. And our first step is to code the arcs on our subsurface sigma prime. And for those of you who've worked with mapping class groups, you know that coding arcs or coding simple closed curves on a surface is very complicated and very technical. So this first step is quite difficult, to give a nice coding of these arcs. And then after that, what we need to do is we can use our code to figure out what the images of these arcs can be under our homeomorphism. And the technical issues there, which don't appear in Juliette's proof, is that if you think about an arc that runs along the boundary of a handle shift, so if this is the boundary of a handle shift, an arc can run along it. When I apply the handle shift, it's just going to get pulled back along itself, and it's going to start to backtrack. So these arcs that I've drawn here are pulled tight. Right, that backtracking has disappeared. And understanding and controlling what backtracking can happen when you apply handle shifts, or more generally compositions of handle shifts, is the most technical part of the paper. And that's a tool that we use. We need to be able to understand that backtracking to show that we actually get a quasi-geodesic axis in this case. Now remember that the goal of this project was to give some idea of what could play the role of a pseudo-Anosov element in a Nielsen-Thurston type classification of elements for big mapping class groups. So one possibility is that it's the loxodromic isometries of the modified arc graph. In the paper with Nick and Priyam, we give some additional evidence. So we study these homeomorphisms a little bit more that we've constructed, and we give a little bit more evidence that they are maybe the right generalization of a pseudo-Anosov. So in particular, we show that they share 2 interesting behaviors with pseudo-Anosov elements in the finite type setting. So first, we show that each of these will give rise to a non-trivial quasimorphism of the mapping class group. And so this is a behavior that is exhibited by pseudo-Anosovs in the finite type setting. Also in the finite type setting, if you take any simple closed curve on your surface and you start hitting it with this pseudo-Anosov element, iteratively, then the limit of that curve is going to be, it's going to converge to a lamination. So you're going to get a sequence of curves which converges to a lamination. And we show, not for any simple closed curve, but that there is a simple closed curve on the infinite type surface, where if you iteratively apply one of our homeomorphisms, one of our loxodromic isometries, then the limit of those simple closed curves, the limit of that sequence of simple closed curves, also approaches a lamination on the surface. So those are 2 additional bits of evidence that these elements that we've constructed behave in a manner similar to pseudo-Anosovs in the finite type case. Thank you for your attention.